A shutter lifted too soon, and someone vanished before dawn. Welcome to the Whimsy Casebook. I am your host, Morgan Finch. Chime in below and let us know where you're watching this mystery unfold from. Your voices bring this casebook to life. Every time. Now let's begin. It was still dark when Maigret stirred. He hadn't quite woken, more like surfaced, but he knew from the damp, musty silence outside the bedroom window that it was going to rain again. The sky, even hidden behind the heavy curtains of the Quai des Orfèvres apartment, pressed down with that grey heaviness peculiar to Paris in late October. Not the sharp, stabbing rain of spring, nor the sudden gusts of summer storms. This was a slow, insistent drizzle that made the city fold into itself. Madame Maigret was already up. He could hear her in the kitchen, moving softly, the occasional click of a spoon on porcelain, as she stirred his coffee perhaps, or buttered a tartine. There was something comforting about that rhythm. She hadn't asked him last night what time he would be home, nor had she asked him this morning what the day would bring. That was their way. 27 years of marriage had smoothed the need for questions. He lit his pipe, though not yet with any great interest, and sat on the edge of the bed, elbows on knees. His back ached a little. He didn't mind. It was the kind of ache that told him the years were passing, but not too quickly. From the hallway she called. The milkman said the bakery across the bridge was open before 6 this morning. He frowned faintly. "Which one?" he asked, not raising his voice. "The little one. Chez Léonard, Rue des Bateliers. That bakery." He pictured it without effort. A narrow storefront, often closed until well past 7, with a discreet blue curtain behind the glass. A widow ran it, Léonard having died of something bronchial, he seemed to recall years before. The woman was quiet, never having much to say when she came by the station to renew her permit each spring. "Odd," he said, more to himself than to her. She came into the room with his coffee, and he nodded his thanks. "It's probably nothing," she said, placing the cup on the little table beside his armchair. Still, the milkman was surprised. That was the thing people noticed when things were out of rhythm. In Paris, life followed its own kind of clock, less mechanical than social. A bakery that opened too early, and a concierge who didn't sweep the steps at the usual hours, those things created small ripples. After breakfast, Maigret walked to the station. He didn't need to, but he liked to. The rhythm of the street helped him think. The rain had begun by then, just lightly, not enough for an umbrella, but enough to soak the shoulders of his coat. The cafes were setting out their chairs under dripping awnings. An old man in a scarf shuffled along the cobbles with a leash, but no dog. Maigret had seen him many times, always walking alone since the spring. At the Rue des Bateliers, he stopped. The shop in question sat like a tired face in a line of narrow grey buildings, its awning pulled down part way, the windows steamed from within. A girl, not the widow, was sweeping the tiled entrance. Young, maybe 25, with a red kerchief and nervous hands. She glanced up when she saw him watching, but didn't smile. The lights were on inside, bright, too bright for that hour, and on a small shelf in the corner, Maigret noticed it immediately. A vase of fresh flowers, trembling slightly from some recent movement. That too was unusual. Madame Léonard didn't usually fuss with such things. He didn't stop. Not then. He kept walking, but the image stayed with him. The girl's pale, distracted face, the scent of yeast and bleach mingled, the flowers too fresh for a day that hadn't yet begun. Back at the office, Inspector Janvier was bent over a report, rubbing his forehead. "Morning, Chief." Maigret hung up his coat. "Anything?" "A body, they say. No details yet. The local gendarmerie called it in just a few minutes ago. A woman, possibly an accident. Rue des Bateliers." Maigret didn't reply. He sat down, filled his pipe again, and lit it slowly. Then, to no one in particular, he said, "Some things don't happen early, unless they're meant to. and the rain tapped lightly at the windows behind him. It was just after 9 when Maigret arrived at Rue des Bateliers. The rain hadn't stopped, but had taken on that steady rhythm that soaks everything without seeming urgent. Paris, under rain, became quieter. Not silent, but muffled, as though the city itself were holding its breath. The street was narrow and crooked, lined with aging facades that leaned ever so slightly inward, like old men peering down at their shoes. The bakery sat halfway down the block, its windows still glowing faintly with the same artificial brightness Maigret had noticed earlier. There were 2 patrolmen posted just outside the entrance. One of them, a pale-faced lad with ears too big for his hat, stiffened when he saw Maigret approach and stepped aside quickly. Inside, the scent of bread had faded, overtaken by something metallic and sour that the inspector recognized immediately. Maigret didn't speak right away. He paused just inside the doorway, letting his coat drip quietly on the tiles. The shop was still warm, the ovens cooling behind the counter. Someone had tried to carry on, perhaps out of habit or shock. A half-filled tray of brioche sat beside the register. A chair had been overturned, and then righted again, clumsily. In the back room, under the low yellow light of a single ceiling bulb, a woman lay on the floor. Her body was curled slightly, as though she had tried to sit but never made it. She wore a wool cardigan and a skirt with faint flower stains. Her head was tilted at an angle, not quite natural, not quite restful. The medical examiner had not yet arrived. A uniformed officer named Lefebvre greeted Maigret with a small nod. She was found around 6:30. The girl, her niece, apparently opened the shop and found her like this. She says she didn't hear anything during the night. Lives upstairs. Anyone else in the building? A tenant in the attic, but he's out of town, works on barges, comes and goes. No one else. Maigret crouched beside the woman, not to examine the body, that would come later, but simply to look. She had been in her 50s perhaps, though it was hard to tell. Her face was slack, but not terrified. There was no sign of struggle. Her hands were folded beneath her, as if she'd accepted something quietly. "Madame Lénard?" he asked. Lefebvre nodded. "Yes, widow, ran the bakery herself for years. The girl just started helping in the mornings." Maigret rose, brushing off his trousers. "Where is she now?" "The niece. In the kitchen. Shaken up. Wouldn't stop talking at first. Now she's quiet." He followed the constable through a narrow hallway to the kitchen at the rear. It was small and plain, with whitewashed walls and the smell of strong coffee. The girl sat at the table, elbows pressed tightly to her sides, her red kerchief still on her head, though it had slipped back slightly. Her eyes were dry, but she looked exhausted, her fingers twitching over a handkerchief folded again and again. She glanced up when Maigret entered, but said nothing. He didn't speak for a long moment. He poured himself a cup of the bitter coffee from the pot on the stove, took a slow sip, then sat down across from her. "You're her niece?" She nodded. "Marie."
"Marie who?"
"Marie Bresson. How long have you been helping your aunt?" 2 months, maybe a bit more. Mornings mostly. She didn't like to get up so early anymore." He nodded as though that explained something. Outside, a car passed, spraying water from the cobbles. "What time did you arrive today?" She looked at the clock on the wall, as if needing confirmation. "Just before 6, maybe 10 too. I have a key." "And you found her?" "In the back. I called the police right away. I didn't know what else to do." Had she seemed ill recently? Marie hesitated. She was tired, always tired, but not sick, I think. She didn't complain. That wasn't her way. Maigret didn't press. He let the silence settle between them. The girl's eyes drifted to her lap. "She argued with someone yesterday," she said suddenly. "A man. I didn't see who. I was in the kitchen, but I heard them." "What time?" "Just before noon. I was shaping the dough." She didn't raise her voice, but she was upset. I could tell. What about him? Quiet. Mostly just listened. But she wasn't happy. Afterward, she told me not to worry. Said it was nothing. Maigret stirred his coffee. Did you recognize the voice? She shook her head. But I thought it might be the man from the bank. She was always nervous when she came back from there. Maigret raised an eyebrow. She owed money. I think so. She never said it, but she'd started cutting corners, buying cheaper flour, complaining about the gas bill. He stood then, moving to the window. From there he could see the narrow backyard, a line of laundry still pinned despite the rain. A single pigeon pecked along the sill. She had no children. No. Husband died. When? 5 years ago. Maigret returned to the table. You said she argued with someone. That doesn't happen often. Marie looked up at him for the first time with something like offense. My aunt didn't argue. She managed people, firm but not angry. She was proud of that. He believed her. After a few more quiet questions, he stepped out into the shop again. Janvier had arrived, shrugging off his coat and glancing toward the back. Heart attack? He asked softly. Maigret shook his head. Too soon to tell, but it doesn't feel natural. No signs of robbery. No. Janvier looked around the shop. So what are we looking at? An argument with a banker, a bakery under financial strain, and a woman who gets up early and finds her aunt dead on the floor. Maigret took his pipe from his coat pocket, but didn't light it. It's not what's here that bothers me, he said. It's what's missing. This place, it's been disturbed, just slightly. Janvier raised a brow. The vase of flowers, Maigret said quietly. Too fresh for yesterday. She never had flowers. The younger man blinked. Maybe the girl brought them. Maybe, or maybe someone else came early. He turned toward the window, where the rain still streaked gently down the pane. Let's find out what kind of man brings flowers to a woman. He argued with the day before she died. The rain had grown steadier by mid-morning, drumming a low rhythm on the tiled roof above the bakery. Inside, the police activity had subsided into something more subdued. The body had been removed discreetly, wrapped carefully, and taken away in a van that barely disturbed the neighborhood. A few passers-by had slowed their steps to look, but most continued on, their collars up and heads lowered. Maigret stood near the back entrance of the bakery, pipe in hand but unlit. The courtyard smelled faintly of wet stone and yeast, the last traces of morning baking still lingering. He hadn't spoken in some time. He was watching the rain trace along the edges of the roof tiles, watching it fall into the rusted gutter, then to the ground, where it disappeared into a small clogged drain. Janvier returned from the building's upper floors, his shoes damp, his brow creased with the mild frustration that comes from finding nothing useful. The attic's just as we thought, he said. Empty. A mattress, a crate of books, some clothes. No signs of anyone having been there for days. The tenant's name is Pierre Vautrin, barge worker, gone for at least a week, according to a neighbor. Maigret nodded, as if that were the answer he expected. Still, his gaze remained on the puddle, slowly forming near the back step. Did you speak to anyone else? Janvier nodded. The butcher across the way saw the lights on early. Thought nothing of it. I assumed Madame Leonard was preparing for the All Saints crowd next week. No mention of a visitor yesterday. Nothing unusual, just that it's not like her to have arguments. Maigret finally turned from the door. She was the sort who kept things tightly wound. Not emotional, not impulsive. The kind of woman who doesn't argue until she has no choice. Janvier glanced toward the kitchen, and the girl, still shaken, but not hiding anything, I think. She's not clever enough to lie properly. Still, we'll keep an eye on her. Fear can make people do strange things. The bakery's bell jingled faintly. A man had stepped in, tall, slightly hunched, with a damp hat and a rain-spotted coat that hadn't seen a tailor in years. He paused when he saw the policeman, uncertain. Maigret walked slowly toward him. "Can I help you?" The man removed his hat. His hair was wet and slicked back, receding. "Yes, I'm Louis Ferret. I heard about Madame Leonard. I supply her with flour. I thought someone should know." Maigret gestured toward the counter. "Come in, Monsieur Ferret. You can speak here." Ferret nodded, stepped further into the warm interior, and rubbed his hands as if to bring back circulation. "I delivered just 2 days ago," he said. She didn't seem herself. Normally she checks the sacks herself, counting every one. That day, she barely looked, signed the invoice without even glancing. "I thought she might be ill." Maigret studied him for a moment. "You've worked with her long." 6 years now, since Leonard passed. She always paid on time, always neat and precise. Lately she'd fallen behind. Small amounts at first, nothing I'd fuss over. But she started asking about credit. You granted it. I said I'd speak to the owner of the mill. I haven't yet. I was giving her time. Maigret nodded, letting the silence stretch. Did she mention anyone new in her life? Ferret looked confused. New? A man, a visitor, someone she might have argued with. No, nothing like that. She was private, proud, but now that you ask, last week, she came into the shop herself, which she never did. She was looking for a new supplier, a different brand of flour, cheaper. She seemed anxious. Maigret filed the detail away. Then, just as the man began to shift, he asked quietly, "You didn't bring her flowers, did you?" Ferret blinked. "Me? Flowers? There were fresh flowers in the shop this morning." The man frowned. "No, that's not something I'd do." Maigret thanked him and let him go. After the door closed, Janvier raised an eyebrow. "We'll confirm his deliveries, but he doesn't seem the type." "Few do," Maigret said softly. Later that day, they visited the branch of Credit Municipal where Madame Leonard had banked. The manager, a pale man with the precise speech of someone accustomed to documents and delays, hesitated only slightly before offering information. She had a small business account. Nothing remarkable, but yes, she was behind on her payments. Her loan was a modest 8,000 francs, secured against her equipment. "She approached you recently." The man adjusted his spectacles. "Last week, she wanted to restructure the loan. She said she needed more time. We scheduled an appointment for next week to discuss options. She seemed resigned, not hopeful." "Did she have a guarantor?" "No. She was quite adamant about handling things herself. Independent, as they say." Outside, the wind had picked up. The rain slanted now, more aggressive, whipping against the windows and sending newspapers fluttering across the street. Maigret stood beneath the awning, watching it, pipe stem between his teeth. "She knew she was out of time," he murmured. Janvier glanced sideways. "So what happened?" "She argued with someone yesterday. The girl says she was upset. Today she's dead. No sign of violence. Just gone." Maigret didn't answer right away. His eyes tracked a boy hurrying past, coat flapping. "She wouldn't have ended her own life," he said at last. "Not like this. Not here. Not with bread in the oven." The comment hung there, suspended like the mist in the air. They returned to the bakery at dusk. The building was quiet now, the lights off, the shutters drawn halfway. Marie sat alone at the small kitchen table, arms crossed, her face tight and unreadable. Maigret didn't sit. He leaned against the door frame. "Tell me about yesterday again," he said. She didn't move. "I already told you everything." Maigret's voice remained even. "You said there was an argument. You didn't see the man, but you think it was someone from the bank." Marie nodded slowly. "Why did you think that?" "She mentioned him once, after a meeting. He said he treated her like a number, not a person." Maigret stepped into the room. What did your aunt do after the argument? She cleaned the counter. She always cleaned when she was angry. No call to anyone. No visit. No. You're sure? Marie looked up, then down again. I went out for a bit, to the post. I was gone maybe 20 minutes. What time? 1:30. Maigret looked at her carefully. And when you returned? She was in the back. Said nothing. Just looked tired. Outside, a car passed. The light was beginning to fade. She was planning something. Maigret said quietly. Not giving up. Not yet. You don't buy flowers if you plan to quit. Marie stared at him. I didn't buy them. No. I believe you. He waited a moment, then nodded. We'll return tomorrow. Stay close. Back at the station, Maigret sat at his desk, the warmth of his office contrasting with the chill outside. He tapped the ashes from his pipe and stared at the wall. There was something in the timing, the early opening, the fresh flowers, a girl who was out for 20 minutes, a debt not large enough to kill for, but enough to shame someone proud. And then the question that mattered most. Who needed her to be gone today? The following morning broke with a dull grey light, the kind that seemed to have seeped from the walls rather than descended from the sky. Paris remained soggy, waterlogged, and bleary-eyed. Puddles had not yet drained from the gutters, and even the pigeons moved slower than usual, heads tucked, wings drooping slightly from the weight of damp. Maigret arrived at the Quai des Orfèvres early, shrugging off his coat and hanging it near the radiator. The office was quiet, the kind of quiet he welcomed, no ringing telephones, no clatter of hurried shoes. He stood at the window for a while, looking out at the Seine as it moved sluggishly past. Rain still clung to the glass in trails. Janvier entered shortly after, carrying 2 coffees in paper cups, one of which he handed to Maigret without a word. Anything from the lab? Maigret asked. Still waiting. They said mid-morning. But I spoke with the baker next door to Madame Leonard's. He says she asked about selling a few weeks ago. Maigret turned his head slightly. Selling? Yes. She mentioned she might close shop and move out to Fontainebleau. Said the city had become too heavy for her. That's not something people say lightly. She had a buyer lined up, not a formal offer, but someone interested. Maigret took a long sip from his coffee, considering. Who? A man named Cassard. Owns 2 other bakeries in the 12th arrondissement. Expanding slowly. He's known to wait for businesses to collapse, then swoop in with a modest offer. Maigret made no reply, but his eyes narrowed faintly. Would she have sold to him? Maybe, but according to the neighbor, she hadn't made up her mind. It was just after 10 when they returned to Rue des Batailles. The rain had paused, though the sky still threatened. Marie was in the shop again, alone behind the counter. She had tied her kerchief tighter today, but her face was pale and drawn. Maigret entered without preamble. You've reopened. She glanced up, surprised. I thought I should. There was dough in the fridge. The regulars expect bread. I didn't want the shop to sit empty. Maigret nodded, his expression unreadable. You said yesterday you didn't bring the flowers. I didn't. Then who had a key to the shop? Marie blinked. Just me and my aunt. And the locksmith maybe. From years ago. No relatives. Friends. She didn't keep friends. Not anymore. Janvier stepped forward. The man who might have bought the bakery. Cassard. Did you ever see him here? Marie hesitated. Once. Last month, he came in and asked questions. My aunt didn't like him. He said he made her feel watched. Was he here yesterday? She shook her head, though not as confidently. Not while I was here. Maigret looked around. The shop smelled faintly of yeast again, but something was off. Too clean. as though someone had wiped it all down with unnecessary diligence. He turned to Marie again. "You said you were out for 20 minutes yesterday. To the post." "Yes. You returned and found your aunt quiet, tired. Do you recall anything else? Anything unusual?" Marie stared at her hands. "No. She was just still. Still." The word lingered in the room. Geneviève and Maigret moved to the back room. The oven had cooled completely. The tray of brioche had not been replaced. There was a rhythm to bakeries, a living one, and this place had lost its pulse. "She didn't plan to die yesterday," Maigret murmured. "But someone else did." They went next to Cassard's office. It was in a narrow building just off Avenue d'Ormesnil, above a cafe that smelled of old grease and overboiled coffee. Cassard was in his late 40s, with a healthy gut and the easy manner of someone used to negotiation. He greeted them without surprise, offering a chair and a cigarette. "I heard about Leonard," he said. "Sad that. She was good at her craft." "You wanted to buy her shop," Maigret said. Cassard gave a small shrug. "I was interested, yes, but she hadn't made a decision. Wasn't in a hurry either. When did you last see her?" 2 weeks ago. I stopped by and asked if she'd thought it over. She said no. That was that. You didn't return?" "No. I don't push. When people are ready, they come to me." Geneviève watched him closely. "Anyone else interested in the shop?" Cassard considered. "No one serious. There's talk about a chain looking to move into the neighborhood, but they wouldn't touch a place like that. Too small, too old-fashioned." Maigret leaned back in his chair. "Did you ever bring her flowers?" Cassard's face twitched into a smile. "No, I bring contracts, not bouquets." They left without pressing further. Outside, Maigret lit his pipe and stood for a long moment on the damp pavement. "He didn't lie," he said, "but he's left something out. Maybe the offer was more than he wants to admit. Or maybe someone else wanted the shop to go to him sooner." Back at the station, a message waited from the lab. Geneviève read it aloud. "Cause of death, cardiac failure. No signs of trauma, but there's a note of mild traces of digitalis in her bloodstream." Maigret closed his eyes. Digitalis, heart medication, but dangerous in large doses. "They're still determining the level." He nodded slowly. "She had no prescription." "None we've found." Maigret stared into the empty space between his desk and the window. If someone gave it to her, it wouldn't take much, especially if she already had a weak heart, and it wouldn't leave marks. No, just a quiet death on a kitchen floor. The hours passed quietly after that. Files were reviewed, neighbors spoken to again. Nothing dramatic surfaced, just small things. Madame Leonard had been seen leaving a pharmacy 3 weeks ago, but the pharmacist remembered nothing unusual. A vendor recalled her forgetting to pay for a delivery once a month prior. Tiny cracks in the picture of a woman trying, quietly, to hold herself together. That evening, Maigret walked alone. The rain had returned, lighter now, more a mist than a downpour. He passed through the Marais, down narrow alleys where the lamps glowed through fog like dull stars. He wasn't chasing a clue. He was walking into the feeling, letting it sink in. A bakery opened too early. A girl who didn't lie well, but who might hide something if asked the wrong way. A man who wanted a business and was patient enough to wait. And someone they hadn't seen yet, who had both motive and access. By the time he returned home, Madame Maigret had already prepared soup. She didn't ask questions. She poured him a glass of wine, sat with her knitting, and said only, "It's not always the person you expect, but it's often the one nearby." He looked up at her and said, "Yes, often it is." Maigret slept lightly that night. The kind of sleep where the body rests, but the mind continues to sift through fragments, like a child panning a stream for glints of gold. He dreamed not vividly, but vaguely shadows moving behind a counter, a woman wiping flour from her hands, a clock ticking too fast. When he woke just before 6, the city outside was still dark, though the sky behind the rooftops had begun to soften. Madame Maigret was already in the kitchen, her dressing gown wrapped snugly, her slippers shuffling gently as she moved between the stove and the table. She didn't turn when he entered. "There's coffee," she said simply. He poured a cup, sat down, and stared into the steam for a while. The silence between them was never uncomfortable. It was the sort of quiet built over years of steady living, each having learned how to leave space for the other to breathe. "You're thinking about that girl," she said finally, not looking at him. He didn't answer at first. Then Marie. "The niece, yes." Madame Maigret stirred her own coffee without drinking it. She was in mourning, of course, but there was something in her face. A stiffness, not grief, exactly. Maigret looked at her. She wasn't crying, his wife added, just holding herself very still. "That's something I noticed too. I remember how I felt when my aunt died," she said quietly. "I was overwhelmed, and we were not even especially close. But the weight of the thing of someone leaving without warning, it leaves a mark. That girl had no mark." He sipped his coffee, let the bitterness sit on his tongue. "She said she was out when it happened." 20 minutes. "She might have been," his wife said. "Or she might have wanted you to think that." He nodded slowly. They ate in silence. The day ahead stretched in his mind like a hallway with doors still closed. He knew what he had to do. Not chase, not pressure, but simply wait. At the station Janvier was already working, papers scattered across his desk like wind-blown leaves. He looked up as Maigret entered. The toxicology report came through. The amount of digitalis found in her blood was low, but enough to raise concern. Could have been accidental, could have been deliberate. No prescription, none we found, no records in her name, no known visits to a cardiologist, nothing suggesting she was being treated. Maigret sat, opened a file slowly. "What about Marie? She's never filled any prescriptions, no known illnesses, quiet life. And the flower vase?" Janvier paused. "I asked the florist 3 streets over. He remembered selling a small bouquet yesterday morning, simple carnations, pale pink, in a glass vase. The buyer, a young woman, red scarf, in a hurry." Maigret didn't blink. "Marie? He thinks so, but he wasn't certain. Says half the girls in the quartier dress that way." Maigret stood. "We'll speak with her again. This time, more gently." The walk to the bakery was familiar now. The narrow Rue des Bateliers, the gutters still collecting leaves, the paint peeling from wooden shutters. Life on the street had resumed its rhythm. A man washed windows across the way. A child walked a step behind her mother, staring up at the crows gathering along the roofline. Marie was inside the bakery, arranging loaves along the shelf. She wore the same red scarf, her expression calm but detached. When she saw Maigret, she stiffened slightly, though her hands didn't stop working. "Inspector." "Marie?" Janvier stood near the door, as Maigret moved closer, but not too close. He stood by the counter, watching her with quiet interest. "Do you remember what flowers were in the vase yesterday?" She paused. "I didn't look closely. They were carnations." She nodded slowly. "Maybe? A florist nearby says a woman in a red scarf bought them just after dawn." Silence. Maigret waited. Finally she said, "I thought it would make the shop feel less empty." He didn't respond, and the silence stretched again. "I didn't mean to lie," she added, more softly. "I just didn't want you to think I was trying to cover something. I didn't know she would die." "You still say you left for 20 minutes, that you were at the post?" She hesitated. Her voice came out smaller now. I was walking. I didn't go to the post. I just needed air. Why not say that? She looked down. I don't know. Margaret turned to glance at Janvier, then back to her. Marie? Were you afraid of your aunt? No. Never afraid. But she was hard, always so sure of herself. And I was always trying to be enough. Enough for what? Marie gave a short, breathless laugh. To stay. She let me work here, but it was never permanent. She said the shop couldn't support two. That when I was stronger, I'd have to go. Margaret leaned his elbows on the counter. Did you know she was trying to sell? Marie's eyes flashed. No. She never told me. She didn't want you to stay. She didn't want to need me. She hated dependence. The rain had started again, faint but persistent. It tapped against the front window like someone too polite to knock properly. Margaret studied the girl's face. Not frightened, not angry, just tired. If she had died naturally, he said, you would have inherited the shop. But she was in debt. The bakery was close to ruin. I didn't know. But someone did. Someone may have given her something digitalis without her knowing. Or perhaps hoping it would end quietly. Marie's lips parted, but no words came. He didn't press. We'll speak again tomorrow, he said gently. Get some rest. Outside, Janvier exhaled. She's not clever enough for murder. No, Margaret agreed. But clever enough to mislead. Maybe even to believe what she wants to be true. They returned to the station. Margaret sat for a long while in his office, reading old reports not because they were relevant, but because it helped him feel the shape of the thing. Patterns revealed themselves not in facts, but in rhythms. By evening, he returned home. The light in the apartment was warm. The kitchen smelled faintly of broth. Madame Margaret sat at the table, shelling peas. She came from somewhere, that girl, she said, as he hung up his coat. Margaret looked over. She's used to waiting, his wife continued. The way she speaks. She listens more than she talks. That's someone who's lived under someone else's rules. She hid the flowers, he said. His wife nodded. She didn't want you to see she cared. Or maybe that she was trying to make things right. Too late. Margaret poured himself a small glass of wine, sat across from her. She lied, but softly. And soft lies, she said, are sometimes the ones meant most sincerely. The sound of rain returned, filling the quiet between them. Outside, Paris remained draped in grey. Inside, Margaret sat, not with answers, but with a growing sense of what the answers might feel like when they came. The next morning began without incident. There was no urgent knock on Margaret's door, no telephone ringing in the early hours. Just the usual sounds of the apartment, the clinking of cutlery, the low hum of the stove, and Madame Margaret, moving about with unhurried precision. It was a Thursday, damp and quiet. The sky had begun to lighten a little, though the air remained heavy, as if the city were unsure whether to commit to rain or let itself dry out. Margaret dressed slowly, adjusting his tie absent-mindedly, his thoughts still clouded with the image of the girl in the bakery, standing stiffly behind her loaves. He was beginning to believe that the key to the entire matter was not in what had been done, but in what had not been said. In that silence was something far louder than confession. At the Quai des Orfèvres, the office was running with its usual dull rhythm. Files were being carried from desk to desk, boots left trails of rainwater across the floor, and someone in the far corner was noisily arguing with a stenographer about a misplaced report. Janvier arrived with a new piece of paper in his hand. His brow creased just slightly. The pharmacy report, he said, placing it in front of Margaret. Digitalis wasn't purchased under Madame Letourneux's name, but Margaret waited. A small vial was purchased 2 weeks ago under the name Mama Breton. It was paid in cash. The pharmacist thought nothing of it at the time. Margaret tapped his pipe on the edge of the desk. Marie Breton, Janvier nodded. Exactly. She has no heart condition. Not that we've found. No medical history. No previous prescriptions. Margaret leaned back in his chair, his eyes settling somewhere beyond the walls of the room. She bought it for someone, or she thought she did. But if it was meant for her aunt, Janvier hesitated. It wasn't enough to kill immediately. No, but if taken unknowingly, in an already weakened heart, they sat with that thought for a moment. I'll bring her in, Janvier offered. No, Margaret said, rising. Not yet, I'll go myself. The bakery was quiet when he arrived. The morning rush had passed, and the air inside smelled faintly of burnt crust and sugar. The front of the shop was empty. Behind the counter, the trays were half filled, the bread laid out without order. Marie was in the back room, seated at the kitchen table, elbows on the surface, her hands covering her face. She didn't look up when Margaret entered. He didn't speak at first. He stood by the doorway, listening to the quiet tick of the wall clock and the hum of the refrigerator. She was still wearing the red scarf, though it had slipped back slightly, revealing hair that hadn't been brushed. When she finally spoke, her voice was dry. I didn't mean for anything to happen. Margaret said nothing. She dropped her hands to her lap. She was always so tired, so angry, sometimes, at the world, at herself, at me. You bought the digitalis. She nodded. I thought it would help her. I read about it, said it helped with fatigue, heart murmurs. I didn't ask a doctor. I didn't think it was dangerous, and you gave it to her. In her tea, just once a day, just a few drops. I didn't think it would hurt. She started sleeping better. Or maybe I imagined it. Did she know? No, I didn't tell her. She would have refused. Margaret moved to the chair across from her and sat. And yesterday? Marie shook her head slowly. I didn't give her anything yesterday. I didn't even see her take tea. She was distant all morning, quiet, like she was somewhere else. You weren't out for a walk, were you? She looked at him. A flicker of something behind her eyes. No. Margaret waited. I was upstairs. I heard her collapse. I waited. He didn't move. I thought if I waited, maybe no one would know. Maybe it would look natural. Why? She swallowed. Because it was already too late. I'd given it to her. And even if it wasn't what killed her, I knew they'd blame me. No one said she was poisoned. She looked away. But you thought it. He didn't confirm or deny. I went down after 20 minutes, she continued. She was gone. Still warm, but gone. I didn't call right away. I cleaned the kitchen. I moved the vase. I opened the shop. Margaret leaned back slightly, to make it look normal. Marie nodded. I didn't know what else to do. She was no longer stiff. Her hands were trembling slightly, and the kerchief had begun to slip more. She looked smaller now, as if the truth had diminished her. I didn't kill her, she said. I tried to help, but I was foolish. I thought I could fix something. Margaret's voice was quiet. You wanted her to be softer. Yes. She wasn't. Marie's eyes welled with tears then, though they didn't fall. She wiped her hands on her apron, as though trying to erase something. She wasn't cruel, she said, but she made everything so hard. Even kindness, even silence. Margaret stood, but not in haste. He rested a hand lightly on the back of the chair. You'll come with me, not under arrest, but we'll talk, properly. Marie nodded. I want to tell it. Everything. Even the parts that don't matter. They all matter, Margaret said softly. As they left the shop, Margaret paused to turn off the front light. The bread remained on the counter, untouched. At the station, Margaret led her not into an interrogation room, but into his office. He poured her a glass of water, let her sit in silence for several minutes before beginning. She spoke slowly, sometimes halting, sometimes going back over her words. She told him about her aunt's temper, about the loneliness that had crept into both of them, about her own sense of inadequacy, about how the shop had become less a place of work than a stage where she failed to perform. Margaret listened without taking notes. He watched the shifts in her voice, the pauses, the memories she lingered on. By the time she finished, dusk had fallen again. The sky outside the window was a darkening grey, heavy with another promise of rain. Margaret walked her to the edge of the corridor. "There will be questions," he said. "But you've done the right thing now. I should have done it earlier. Yes. But now is better than not at all." She looked at him, her eyes clearer now. "Will they believe me? Some will, some won't. But that's always the way." She nodded. As she walked away, her footsteps faded into the quiet hallway. Margaret returned to his desk. He didn't light his pipe. He simply sat, hands folded, listening to the rain beginning again outside. He was not angry. He wasn't even surprised. The end hadn't come with a confession, or a moment of high drama. It had come as they always did in his experience, softly, from exhaustion, and from someone no one thought capable of harm. Not out of malice, not even desperation, just a quiet wish for change, and a mistake too small to stop once it had begun. It was the stillness after the confession that lingered with Margaret more than the words themselves. Not because Marie Bresson had surprised him. He had felt her quiet guilt pressing through the seams of her careful routine from the beginning. But because her story had settled with such finality, there was no twist to expect, no missing thread, just a young woman overwhelmed by loneliness, held under the slow suffocation of obligation, who had tried, clumsily and tenderly, to make things better, and failed. And yet Margaret couldn't quite let go. The following morning was dry. The rain had finally exhausted itself. Paris had taken on a softer complexion, its streets scrubbed clean by the storms. The smell of damp stone was slowly giving way to the scent of coal smoke and roasted chestnuts. The air, while cool, carried a freshness that made one breathe a little deeper. At the Quai des Orfèvres, Janvier was filing the preliminary report. He glanced up as Margaret entered. "She's still here," he said quietly. "They've put her in the interview room, not formally charged yet. Just waiting." Margaret nodded. "She's not a criminal in the usual sense." "No, but she's not innocent either." Margaret poured himself a coffee and drank it in silence. A few officers passed outside the glass window of his office. He watched them idly. Then, more to himself than to Janvier, he said, "There's something missing, something small, but important." Janvier looked up from the report. "You think she's lying? Not about the medication, not even about her intentions, but something in the timing, something doesn't sit." She admitted to being upstairs, to hiding. "Yes. But the flowers, Janvier, they weren't just placed, they were arranged. You said she brought them." "Yes. But think about it. The way she said she chose them impulsively, early in the morning, and yet they were in a cut glass vase, with the stems trimmed and the water fresh. That's not panic. That's ritual." Janvier frowned. "So she's done it before, perhaps, or someone else has." Margaret stood abruptly. "I'm going back. One last time." He returned to the bakery just after 10. The shop was shuttered again, locked and cold. The key sat in an envelope on his desk, given by Marie the day before. He used it now, turning it slowly in the lock, pushing open the wooden door with a faint creak. Inside, the air had settled. Without baking, without life, the place had become inert. He walked past the empty counter, through the kitchen, and into the small rear room where the cot still sat in one corner, the window half fogged by condensation. The vase was there on the shelf, still holding the wilted flowers. He picked it up, turning it slowly in his hands. The base was etched with the name of a crystal shop near the Pont de Sully. Not the sort of item one purchased casually. It was a gift, most likely, or something sentimental. Maigret replaced it gently, and turned to the desk beside the window. A drawer sat slightly ajar. Inside papers. Recipes in longhand. Bills both opened and unopened. But among them, tucked between two old ledgers, was a small envelope. No address. No postmark. Just a single folded slip of paper. Maigret opened it. One line. Ink slightly faded. You looked tired this morning. Let me help. Just once. No signature. He read it twice, then again. Back at the station, he placed the note on his desk and stared at it. Janvier leaned in. What is it? Maigret didn't answer immediately. This was written before she died, perhaps even before the flowers were placed. It's someone else's voice, not Marie's. A lover, maybe, or someone who cared from a distance. A regular, a vendor. He tapped the note. The penmanship elegant, male I'd say, and the tone, it's apologetic, subdued. A man who doesn't want to intrude but feels compelled to act. Do you think he's the one who gave her the digitalis? Maigret shook his head. No. Marie bought the medication. That much is clear. But what if someone else noticed she was ill? Someone she confided in? Janvier sat back. That would explain the flowers, and the note. A quiet act of kindness. Or guilt. They called in the local delivery men, vendors, and one or two former customers. Most had nothing to say. A few offered vague recollections of Madame Lénard being quieter in recent weeks, more withdrawn. Then came Louis Ferret, their flower supplier. Maigret watched him closely as he entered the office. The man looked the same as before, worn coat, large hands, slow movements, but something in his expression had shifted. He seemed heavier, as though the atmosphere had settled on his shoulders. You came the morning she died, Maigret said. You said you'd heard the news, and wanted to show respect. Ferret nodded. That's right. Maigret placed the note on the desk. Recognize this? Ferret looked down at it. His face remained neutral. No, should I? Maigret tilted his head. The penmanship is familiar. You strike me as the kind of man who writes letters rather than makes telephone calls. Still the man didn't respond. Maigret took a different tack. She confided in someone. Someone who noticed her fatigue. Someone who brought her flowers not to seduce, but to soothe. And someone who knew she wouldn't accept help, unless it was unspoken. Ferret's eyes shifted. Just once. She was proud, Maigret continued. Too proud to say when she was in pain. But maybe once. She let her guard down. Silence. Then almost inaudibly, Ferret said, she mentioned palpitations. One evening, when I came late with the flower, said she'd been having dizzy spells. I told her she should see a doctor. Did you give her anything? Ferret shook his head. No. But I wrote that note. I didn't sign it. I thought it would embarrass her, but I didn't want to do nothing. You brought the flowers. Yes. Early. Before deliveries. I left them at the back. She didn't speak of it. Maigret nodded slowly. And that morning, I came by, but the shop was quiet. I assumed she was sleeping. Then I heard later what had happened. Why didn't you say all this before? I didn't want to be caught up in it. I didn't do anything wrong. But I cared for her. Maigret let the silence stretch. He saw no lies in the man's posture, only shame and regret. When Ferret left, Yomvia looked at Maigret across the room. So he knew. And he tried to help. Yes. And Marie, she still gave the medication. But not out of malice. Out of desperation. Yomvia frowned. So who's responsible? Maigret lit his pipe at last. The match flared, briefly illuminating his face. They both are, he said. In different ways. But not as murderers. As people who wanted to help and failed. Yomvia said nothing. Outside, the city had begun to glow with the late afternoon light. The rooftops drying. The streets busy again. Inside, the story had quietly ended. Not with guilt, not with innocence, but with the quiet weight of human error, heavy and unspoken. It was the kind of morning Paris sometimes allowed in late autumn, cool, but not biting, still but not silent. The rain had retreated for the time being, leaving everything damp but glistening, as if the city had been polished overnight. The cobblestones along the quay had that dark sheen they took on after several days of drizzle, and the trees along the embankment held the last of their yellowing leaves, like tired thoughts they hadn't quite let go. Maigret stood at his office window, watching the sluggish flow of the Seine. Below, a man in a grey cap was feeding crumbs to a circle of pigeons, who waddled in choreographed circles, pecking and retreating. A river barge moved slowly in the distance, its low engine grumbling like a stomach. The world had resumed its rhythm, quietly, without ceremony. Inside, Yomvia placed the final version of the case file on Maigret's desk. He tapped it once with his fingers. The magistrate reviewed it. There'll be no formal charges. Not against Marie. Not against Ferret. The coroner's report calls the death natural cardiac failure, likely exacerbated by stress, and possibly the presence of the drug. But nothing conclusive. Maigret nodded, but said nothing. Marie was released an hour ago, Yomvia added. I asked if she wanted an escort home. She said no. Just asked if the shop would be sealed long. She'll go back, Maigret said quietly. She'll bake again. You think so? Yes. Not immediately. But eventually. She has nowhere else to go. Yomvia hesitated. Do you believe her? I believe she told the truth as she understood it. Yomvia glanced toward the hallway. And Ferret, a man who cared and didn't know how to show it. There are worse sins. He moved to the desk, picked up the file, and opened it without reading, just touching the paper, as if feeling its weight might tell him something more than the contents ever could. Everyone tried to help in their own way, he said. None of them quite knew how. They left the office together shortly before noon. It was a rare thing, stepping out in the middle of the day, without urgency, without a case dragging behind them like a second shadow. They crossed the Pont Saint-Michel, their coats open to the light breeze. A dog barked from somewhere behind a bakery. A tram bell rang in the distance, bright and hollow. They stopped at a small café near the edge of the 5th arrondissement, one of those tucked-away places where the tables were small and round, and the coffee came thick in little white cups. The proprietor nodded when he saw Maigret, and brought two without asking. They drank in silence for a while. Yomvia finally spoke. You ever wonder how many stories like this don't get noticed? Maigret gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. Most of them, he said, people make mistakes. Hide them. Sometimes they go unnoticed, sometimes they cause more harm. But mostly, they just disappear into the walls. It's not our job to punish every mistake. Maigret said, only to understand them. Janvier nodded slowly, absorbing the words. Across the street, a mother pulled her child's cap snug against the wind. The child turned to look at the pigeons dancing along the curb, then laughed as one flapped up suddenly, scattering the rest. "Do you think she knew?" Janvier asked. "Marie? No, Madame Leonard. Do you think she suspected someone was giving her something?" Maigret exhaled through his nose. "She may have, or she may have simply felt the limits of her own strength approaching. Sometimes the body knows before the mind does. Do you think she would have forgiven her niece?" Maigret took a long sip of coffee before answering. "I don't think she was the forgiving type, but I don't think she would have hated her either. That kind of pride, it allows very little room for emotion. And that was the trouble between them." They sat a while longer. Eventually, Janvier said, "So, that's it." "Yes," Maigret said, "that's it." And it was. The shop remained closed for another week. The curtain stayed drawn, the window display empty. A single note appeared on the door, handwritten, uneven, "Closed until further notice. Thank you for your patience." Neighbors passed it with silent curiosity. Some speculated quietly over morning cigarettes. Others nodded knowingly, as if they had long expected the quiet crumble of the Leonard bakery. But no one knocked, no one pried. Maigret did not return to the bakery. He let the case fall into the sediment of his mind, joining the many others that had ended not with clarity, but with the slow fog of human error, pride, and ordinary sorrow. These were the cases that stayed with him not because they were the most tragic, but because they were so terribly familiar. A week later he and Madame Maigret sat in their apartment after dinner. The window was closed against the returning chill. She was knitting a sweater she would never finish. He was reading a newspaper he hadn't really started. "You were quiet this week," she said. He grunted softly. Was it the girl? He folded the paper carefully, then set it aside. "She didn't mean harm," he said. "No, but that doesn't mean there was none." He nodded, slowly. She poured him a small glass of brandy and set it before him. He took it with a murmur of thanks. "They didn't teach us about people like that," he said after a while. "When I was in training, we studied thieves, murderers, people who planned, people who ran, but no one warned us about the ones who just meant well. They're the hardest to forget," she said. He looked at her, then down into his glass. "Yes," he said, "they are." And they sat in the quiet as the evening folded itself gently around them, and the rain began again on the roof. The bakery on Rue des Bateliers reopened 2 weeks later. There was no grand announcement, no advertisement in the paper. One morning, the shutters were simply folded up again, the door propped open with a wedge of old stone, and the faint smell of yeast once more drifted onto the street. A fresh coat of white paint had been applied to the wooden trim around the windows, though imperfectly, with slight unevenness at the corners. The sign above the door remained the same, Boulangerie Leonard, though the gold lettering had faded. Maigret passed by on his way to the station, not intending to stop. He had not seen Marie Bresson since the day she was released, nor had he looked for her. The case had ended officially, and in most ways, emotionally. But when he saw the open door, the warm orange light spilling onto the sidewalk, he paused. Inside, Marie stood behind the counter, her back to the street, placing croissants into a basket. Her movements were slower now, not with fatigue, but with deliberation, as though she were rehearsing each gesture before performing it. She wore a plain grey apron, her scarf was gone, her hair was tied back simply. She did not see him at first. Maigret stepped through the doorway, not fully entering, but enough to feel the warmth from the ovens. She turned then, startled for a moment, before recognition softened her face. "Inspector, I was passing by." She nodded. "It's good to be open again. The smell, it helps." He glanced around. The counters were clean, but not scrubbed with the anxious energy of grief. The displays were modest, There were only a few loaves, a tray of pain au chocolat, and a single tart placed in the center of the glass case. "You're managing alone," she nodded. "For now. I wake earlier now. I prepare smaller batches, but it helps to move again, to knead the dough, feel the rhythm of the oven." He let his eyes wander over the shop. "You kept the vase." She looked toward the shelf near the window. The crystal vase remained there, now holding a sprig of eucalyptus and one white carnation. "I couldn't throw it out," she said. "I thought about it. I held it in my hands for a long time, but it didn't feel right." He gave a small nod. "She knew about the digitalis," Marie said suddenly, not looking at him. Maigret didn't answer. "I found the bottle, the one I hid. It had been moved." He waited. She never said anything, but the last 2 days before, she stopped drinking the tea. She made her own, different mug. "I noticed, but I said nothing." Her voice was flat, but not emotionless, more like a page being turned carefully, without haste. "She knew, and she forgave me in her own way." Maigret watched her for a long moment. "Perhaps." Marie stepped forward slightly, wiped her hands on her apron. "Do you believe I meant to hurt her?" "No," Maigret said. "But intent doesn't always prevent harm." She nodded. "I'm not sure what I'll become, Inspector," she said softly. The shop was hers. Everything I did here was in her shadow. Now it's just me, and I'm not sure who I am without her. That's something we all face, sooner or later. She looked down at the counter, then up again. "Do people forget in time?" Maigret shook his head. "No, but they remember less often." A quiet passed between them. "I'll take a brioche," he said. She smiled faintly, turned, and placed one into a small paper bag. When she handed it to him, her hands were steady. He paid without a word, and stepped back into the morning, the warmth of the shop falling away behind him. The rest of the day unfolded without event. At the Quai des Orfèvres, reports were filed, a minor theft resolved, a missing persons case closed after the man was found sleeping off a binge in the Bois de Vincennes. Paris returned to its routine. That evening, Maigret sat on the bench outside the café on the Rue Saint-Louis and Lille, the one with the narrow view of the river through the alley. The wind had turned colder. He pulled his coat tighter, watching a couple walking hand in hand, their laughter soft, private. In his pocket, the bag with the brioche remained untouched. He had no appetite. Not yet. He wasn't haunted by Marie, or Madame Leona, or even Ferret. He was haunted, if the word could be used at all, by the echo of ordinary people trying to navigate life with imperfect maps. Each of them had tried to love, or help, or escape. None had done so skillfully, but all had tried. He thought of the letter, that one line, "You looked tired this morning. Let me help." Just once, he had kept a copy of it, not for evidence, but because it was the kind of sentence that lived on in the mind. A quiet sentence, a human sentence. Maigret knew now what had happened. Marie had, in a small, misguided way, wanted to ease her aunt's burden. Ferret, equally unsure, had left flowers and words instead of direct intervention. And Madame Leona, proud to the end, had accepted what came with silence, and perhaps a tired resignation. No villains, no evil, just people. And it was that simplicity that gave Maigret the most pause. Because he had always known that murder was rarely about hatred. It was about pressure, and love and shame, and accident. And sometimes the deepest sadness came not when someone died violently, but when someone died quietly, carrying too much for too long. He rose as the street lamps flickered on, casting weak yellow halos on the damp pavement. He walked slowly, his hands deep in his pockets, the smell of wood smoke drifting from a chimney somewhere behind him. The city moved around him, not with urgency, but with persistence. A tram clattered in the distance. A dog barked, then fell silent. The evening settled into itself. Back home, Madame Maigret was reading. She looked up as he entered. "You're late," she said. I stopped by the bakery. His wife gave a small satisfied nod. I thought she would. He placed the paper bag on the table, and stretched his legs. She said something interesting, he murmured. She said she didn't know who she was now. Madame Maigret looked at him, then at the bag. She'll find out. We always do, after the grief has quieted. Maigret didn't reply. He reached for the brioche, broke it in two, and handed her half. They ate in silence. Outside, the wind turned again, but the rain did not return, and the shop that had once opened too early now opened on time. November wore on. The rain returned, not with violence, but with an old persistent rhythm, as if reminding Parisians of its long-standing arrangement with the city. It came softly, with a whisper over rooftops, and a shimmer across the cobblestones. Umbrellas bloomed and folded like breath. Shopkeepers leaned into their doorways. Children splashed and were scolded. The Seine rose slightly and drifted higher against its mossy banks. Maigret sat at his usual corner table at Brasserie Dauphine, his pipe unlit, his coat still beaded with droplets from his short walk. The smell of onions and broth drifted from the kitchen. Rain tapped gently on the window beside him, not urgent, just steady, a comforting sound in its way. He stirred his beer with a finger, absently, his gaze focused on nothing in particular. The case had ended. Officially it had never truly been one. A death classified as natural, no arrests, no inquiries dragging on through the courts, just a report filed and signed, then placed in the drawer with the others, where stories without headlines went to sleep. But the weight of it had remained with him, not as guilt or frustration, but as a question without a clear ending. Not a question of who had done what, but of what had truly been done. It was a week since he'd last passed by the bakery. He hadn't meant to avoid it, but something in him resisted returning. Curiosity wasn't the reason he'd visited in the first place. It was instinct, and now instinct told him to leave it be. Across the cafe, a young man in a tan raincoat was trying to dry his glasses with the edge of a napkin. A woman waited beside him, expression serene, her coffee untouched. The ordinary scenes always calmed Maigret, more than any conclusion. They reminded him that life continued, that under the weight of tragedies, both small and large, people still waited, still dried glasses, still stirred drinks. Madame Maigret had asked him the night before, as she folded laundry on the armchair by the window, whether he believed Mary Bresson would ever forgive herself. He hadn't answered then. Now sipping his beer, he thought about it again. Could she? Should she? He didn't know. Forgiveness wasn't something he was trained in. It wasn't part of the report, but he believed quietly that people found ways to carry their mistakes, not erase them, but live with them. That in time, the burden reshaped itself, still present, but no longer sharp. A hand tapped the glass behind him. He turned. Outside, beneath the cafe awning, stood Louis Ferret. His coat was too thin for the rain, and his hat hung awkwardly from one hand. He looked like he hadn't planned to stop, just happened to be passing, and had paused. He gave Maigret a small nod, one that asked permission without words. Maigret returned the gesture. Ferret stepped in, wiping his shoes carefully on the mat. He removed his coat, shook it lightly, and approached the table. "Mind if I join you, Inspector? Sit." They didn't speak for a moment. A waiter passed, and Ferret ordered a coffee. When it arrived, he cradled the cup in both hands. "I was in the neighborhood," he said after a time, "checking on deliveries." Ferret nodded. Mary ordered again. Only half her usual amount, but she said she wanted to keep a regular schedule. Maigret puffed on his pipe, though it remained cold. "She's still alone, for now," said she might take on a part-time boy, a student from around the corner, someone to help with the lifting. Maigret nodded. "That's something." Ferret's eyes remained on the steam rising from his cup. "I go early, before she opens. Leave the sacks by the back door. Sometimes she's already there, sometimes not. Maigret watched him carefully. You're still leaving flowers? Ferret glanced up, startled, then smiled softly. Not always, but yes. She never mentioned it. She doesn't need to. I leave them, she finds them. We don't speak of it. Another silence settled, not uncomfortable. Ferret finally added, I think she's beginning to forgive herself. Maigret said nothing. The rain picked up for a moment, tapping harder on the windows, before softening again into a mist. The city was still in motion beyond the glass drums, bicycles, figures wrapped in scarves, but inside, the cafe had gone still. She told me, Ferret continued, that the shop feels different now, not better, just different. It would. She said she dreams about her aunt, but not in anger, just dreams where they work side by side again, and sometimes they laugh. Maigret looked down at the condensation forming on his beer glass. People live longer in memory than they do in life, he said. Ferret finished his coffee in one last sip, stood, adjusted his collar. I'll be off then. Maigret looked up. Take an umbrella next time. Ferret smiled. Not much point. Paris always finds its way in. When he was gone, Maigret sat a while longer. He didn't feel lighter. That wasn't the right word. But he felt settled. Like a drawer that had stuck for weeks had finally slid shut. He returned to the Quai des Orfèvres just before 4, shook off his coat, and sat at his desk. A few papers waited for him, none of them urgent. He read one slowly, then turned to the next. The routine comforted him. A knock came on the doorframe. It was Janvier, holding a report. Petty theft on the Rue de la Clef. A boy took cigarettes. Nothing serious. Maigret nodded. Let him off with a warning. Already done. Janvier lingered. Something else. I saw the bakery was open again. Yes. Smelled good. It always did. Janvier smiled faintly. You did the right thing. Maigret didn't answer. He glanced toward the window instead, where the streetlights had begun to flicker on through the haze. When Janvier left, Maigret stood and walked to the glass, looking down at the glistening streets. Rain glimmered on the pavement, turning ordinary stones into mirrors. Paris reflected itself in 1,000 shimmering pieces, none quite whole. He thought again of Mary Bresson, of her hands in flour, of the quiet she had tried to keep, of the woman who had raised her, then kept her at a distance, of the man who had offered kindness too late, but not in vain. And finally, he thought of the shop, open now, just as it always had been. Only this time, it opened at the right hour, not too early, not too late, but exactly when it needed to.